encourage you to put things in that. So again, the time that you have spent setting up will give you better quality notes because of that.
Yeah, and a variety of field notes, yes, you want to be set up. Observing directly, okay, is the observation is central to qualitative research. It entails a systematic noting and recording of events, behaviors, and artifacts. We want to talk about the objects that were in the room too, the way the classroom was set up, things like that. In the social setting known as field notes. Okay? It's accomplished visually and through other senses as well. Example, sometimes the children can hear a sound, one of those sounds in the room, right? That perhaps other people in the room can't hear. It might affect some children and not others. Observation is fundamental and highly important, of course, we've said that. Used to discover complex interactions in natural social settings, affected by body language and tone of voice. Challenging due to the vast amounts of fast-moving and complex behavior.
And by the way, if you only have transcripts,
You won't know.
you list a lot of the body language and tone of voice.
Yeah. Yeah. And tone of voice, when you're saying such like that too, you can get biased in it as well. She was talking, seriously, she was talking in an angry voice, and perhaps it was, she just talked louder. Yeah. Participant observation is developed from cultural anthropology and qualitative sociology. Those two put together. That's the background. The researcher is both a participant and an observer, okay? Experiencing reality as the participants do. That's sitting in. At the proposal stage, elaborate on planned extent of participation. Okay? If you're writing a proposal, that's going to have this type of qualitative research in it. Includes ethical studies, issues such as respect for persons, and should also be appropriately discussed during the proposal. Okay, any ethical implications, that was a big part of this chapter as well. Okay. Interviewing in depth as one way of doing, a third way of primary data. Okay. 3 general types of interview: informal or conversational, takes place on the spot. Interview guide or topical approach, structured, scheduled. Interviewer is prepared with topics and questions. They prepared in advance. Standardized or open-ended elaborations, clarifications, and detailed elaborations. And interviewing benefits.
Okay, go back
Yeah,
one.
Yeah.
A lot of times on that one, we talk about the 3 distinctions as being structured, semi-structured, and unstructured. And structured would be where you, and a lot of times this would be a quantitative survey, but you could also do, sometimes if you're interviewing people over the phone, you could do that. Structured would be where both the question is the same for everybody and the responses are the same. So you read them, everybody gets the same 10 questions read to them, and each one has a choice of this, 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 or this. So both the question and the answers are structured. They have to choose from that. Semi-structured is where the question is the same to everybody, but then it's an open-ended question, so each respondent answers as he or she would. And then unstructured is where now you don't even have structured questions, you just have a set of 5 or 6 points, which you've written down on a 3x5 card, and then you have an interview with a conversation with that person, and somewhere during the course of the interview, you work in each of the points that's on that card, but you work it in the context of that conversation.
Yes.
And so how you would word the question to the person for each of those 6 issues, let alone how they would answer it, would be completely open-ended. So those are sometimes parallel to that, as structured, semi-structured, and unstructured. Qualitative interview studies are most often semi-structured, where you're interviewing 15 people, you ask them all the same questions, but then they're free to answer. That would be the most common of those 3.
So let's say you set up your interviews and you've got your 10 questions. but then it's semi-structured. So something comes up in the middle of the interview that would prompt you to add a follow-up question.
You can certainly do that.
Okay. Without having to, like, let's say this is a fifth interview, without having to go back and ask the other four that follow-up question, or?
Probably not, because that's just circumstantial to that.
Okay. Interviewing benefits from this, which Dr. Stephen encourages us to do here, is yield data in quantity and quickly, immediately follow up, and clarifications are possible. There you go. You can follow up and have clarifications possible. That was the answer to your question there. Eh? Combined with observations allows the researcher to understand the meanings everyday activities hold for people, if done properly. Okay. Interviewing limitations. Encounters are intimate and depend on trust. Okay, that's a big one too. You want to have people that are actually going to speak to you and give you valid data. Parties may be unwilling or uncomfortable sharing all information. Interviewer may lack fluency or familiarity and not ask particular questions. That's why you need to be prepared in advance. Interviewers' interpretations may not be accurate. Might get confabulation. They believe something that's not true. Interviewers need superb listening skills and good recording devices. Skillful at personal interaction, good at question framing and probing for elaboration.
All right, go back to the very first one. Say what you did about superb listening skills.
Superb listening skills and or good quality recording information, probably both.
You have to check out, first of all, invest in some, with the kinds of stuff we have now, digital technology is much better than the old tape recordings and everything. Check all of that out, make sure it works so that we don't have the kind of snafus we have today. Test that, make sure that you can get it recorded. All of that stuff needs to be done before you go out into the field to use that stuff. And sometimes people make the mistake that they haven't tested that out, and then they get back in and say, oh, how do I get to, so that's all stuff that has to be done ahead of time in terms of checking out your study and how it's going to go. That's one of the reasons a lot of people do pilot studies, because during the pilot study you can check that stuff.
3 types of questions to gather cultural data are descriptive, broad, allows the researcher to learn about the participants' views. Structured, there you go, discover the basic ways the participants organize their cultural knowledge into categories that are important to them. And contrast provides meaning of various terms that elaborate what something is or what something is not like. This is the word. Say this word for me, Bobby. Because I know I get
Phenomenological.
I always want to go phenomena. Phenomenological? Is that close enough?
Phenomenological.
Yeah, I said it.
Yeah.
It just sounds like phenomena to me, though.
Yeah.
Phenomenological.
Okay.
I
You're good.
I should have used the methods.
It makes me feel very vulnerable. Yeah. Interviewing. A specific type of in-depth interviewing, which is the study of lived experiences and ways we understand those experiences to develop a worldview. The primary advantage, it permits an explicit focus on the researcher's personal experience combined with those of the interview partners. And disadvantage, labor-intensive and requires reflexive. People can look back on themselves, researchers.
Okay, before you go on,
Yes.
a proviso here. Phenomenological is one of several qualitative genres. And we didn't have chapter 2 today because Joetta was going to do that. So when we cover that, you'll see.
Joanne was gonna do that, but I
Yeah.
will do it.
I'm sorry. Joanne. I was thinking Joanne, and I said Joetta.
I'm in her seat.
But
And we look so much alike.
there are a number of different genres of qualitative research, and that is one. if you get into the study of qualitative, what you'll find is that many phenomenological researchers will say that there is a specific phenomenological method
You can just-
that goes with it, huh?
You can just say that word, so,
They're
yeah,
bold.
it just rolls
But
off.
just working at it for a while. Anyway, I'm not so sure that I think that it is always that bad to uncouple specific phenomenological approach. It seems to me that there are times, study of the lived experiences and the ways we understand those experiences to develop a worldview. That applies to an intense investigation of many topics, which we may or may not necessarily have to get that understanding through a specific methodology that is consistent with what phenomenological researchers say this. That is, there are general approaches to getting qualitative information that involve semi-structured interviews or observations and other things. And I think that you can do a phenomenological interview, that is, that you're focused on lived experiences, understanding of that, without necessarily doing, okay, I have to do this particular funny little set of methodological issues. Now, part of that, they will suggest that you have to interview people twice, and I don't know that that's a level of degree. So I don't know why you couldn't do a set of in-depth, semi-structured interviews.
If your questions
Well, you know, if
structured.
you're interviewing 15 people, if these interviews last an hour, you're getting phenomenological information about that. But because you didn't do exactly the methods that they say, you didn't do a phenomenological study. So to me, sometimes I think that people can get too into, this is my genre, and not only is this what it means, but it has to be done this particular methodology.
Yes,
Okay, and I think people can get too hung up on that.
on the categories, yeah.
Yes.
Focus group interviews, I think this is one of your specialities, you like to.
Well, and I don't know that it's one of my specialties, but several of my students have done them, and the Iconda Guerra study, the young lady from Panama who did the study of Latino freshmen, she did focus group interviews. And so if you're thinking about doing that, there's a dissertation that's kind of a model in terms of what it looks like methodologically, even though your topic would be different from hers. But you can get a lot of information from focus groups that you can't get when you're doing several interviews. If you do 15 interviews with individuals versus 6 focus groups with 7 to 10 people, well, what's 6 times 8? That's 48 people versus 15. So, I mean, they have different purposes. Also, who's your unit of analysis? If you're interviewing students, probably makes more sense to do focus groups. If you're interviewing principals, you probably wouldn't be doing focus, you'd probably be doing individual interviews. So a lot of that, what stakeholder group are you looking at? So all of that has to be taken into account into these kinds of issues.
Okay, yeah. Right here, the idea comes from market research, having.
But it has been, although it came from there, social sciences are using it more and more.
Okay. Composed of 7 to 10 people.
And you might do it with 5 or 6. Again, those are rules of thumb.
Yeah. Unfamiliar with one another but have certain relevant characteristics in the group. Maybe conducted several times with different individuals. Used to identify trends in the perceptions and opinions expressed. Trends.
The interview schedule for a focus group might not be all that much different than the interview schedule for semi-structured interviews.
Other methods, life histories, narrative inquiry, digital storytelling, useful for giving the reader and insiders. Review of a culture during an era in history, can add depth and evocate illustration, a large amount of data.
By the way, there are some people that call qualitative research in general just an expansion of storytelling. But then there are different kinds of storytelling. There's digital, there's video, there's phenomenological, there's narrative. So, I mean, but in many instances, qualitative research is simply telling a story about the group or groups that you're studying.
Disadvantage, generalizing is difficult, sample size is small, and few concepts to guide analysis. You need trust, and it can be time consuming.
Yes. By the way, a lot of people who think that they are qualitative researchers also think that they're going to get done in a hurry. And qualitative research is labor intensive. So if you're doing that, be aware of the fact that it's labor intensive.
There's also the difficulties of interviewing elites and children. Okay? In interviewing elites, positions of power and influence offer valuable information with overall view, but may be difficult to contact people such as that. Okay?
If you want to interview deans of colleges of education, and you're a student from Podunk University who doesn't know anybody, what makes you think that these deans are going to give you time to do that?
Yes.
You know, and even more so, what about presidents of universities? Or you want to interview ex-presidents. Probably easier than sitting presidents, but you know, again.
Even elites in another way, I mean convicts or such, getting their permission to go in, unusual groups. And children, of course, can be difficult too. And again, the word confabulation comes in there too, them believing something that's not necessarily true. Interviewing across differences and social identities. Shared identity, such as gender. Do not assume that because we have the same gender, we're going to understand each other. Okay. Professional identity, someone may say, oh, you know how it is. Well, no, have them explain, because your perception of how it is may be different from their perception of how it is. Okay. You need to use follow-up questions. And a fourth way is analyzing documents and material culture by visiting the Vulcan Municipal Library.
You also have an example of that in your dissertations, the Rhonda Mattingly dissertation is an example of that. Interesting study, by the way. She was a speech-language pathologist, and she had both of my policy class and my capstone policy class. Good student, we got along fine. And she came to my office one day and said, Steve, would you chair my dissertation? And I looked at her and I laughed and I said, Rhonda, I don't know a thing, because I knew that she was going to do something speech language related. And I said, I don't know a thing about speech and language. Why would you want me to chair your dissertation? She said, well, I want you to help me do it right. And she said, I have content people that can help me with the content. So anyway, she twisted my arm, talked me into this. She had, her specialty was speech language pathology with pediatric kids with cerebral palsy. And the problem that she had was that the speech language, the occupational therapy, and what's the third one? There's occupational and physical. So the three of those are all related but somewhat distinct. And when she had clients kids, out in the further reaches of rural Kentucky, even though she was based in Louisville, it was sometimes difficult to find, let alone insurance to pay for, a physical therapist and a occupational therapist, so that they simply weren't available, so that all three, and a lot of those kids had multiple troubles, so you really needed the expertise of all three. Even in Louisville, where all three were available, insurance would often not cover all three. So here you had the situation, she was a speech language pathologist, she has sometimes had to know what the physical therapist and the occupational therapist knew, and she had to figure that out on her own. Similarly, only the other way around, if you were an occupational therapist, you had to figure out what the other two. So her dissertation kind of became taking the extant current state of knowledge in all three with respect to pediatric cerebral palsy, and then took that through content analysis and combined the three literatures into one. This is what you need to know from all three perspectives if you're working with this population. Really a massive taking, but really a fascinating thing.
Important, I know,
It's
2002.
It's needed.
Yes.
I have a child that gets physical and occupational therapy. One, if anybody is gonna be a physical therapist, they're in dire need of them. They've stopped this therapy because there's no one that can invest it. But Cheryl's very proactive and well versed with her child. And if you don't go in there and let them know, he's getting this, and this is what we're doing.
See, and a lot
you're in
of,
trouble.
all right, but now look,
Most parents
you're
don't.
professional parents.
Yeah.
You
Right.
know to do that. There are a lot of parents who are intimidated, they're not well educated, they don't know to do that, they don't have the skills to advocate for their children, and then what happens to all those kids?
Yes. Well, not only, there's just like, in the rural settings, there aren't those facilities. There aren't the people to give those therapies. And in 2002, there was the Protection and Advocacy went in and sued the state of Kentucky, saying that there were all these children that weren't receiving the services that they should receive. And so mini grants are given to parents to go and find their own, but it's only to the parents who are educated and go for those grants, because it's not told.
And if there's a general shortage
There's
for
a-
that,
There is.
then even if everybody went out, there'd still be a shortage, because there's
Yes.
not enough to go around. There's enough to go around because not everybody seeks it.
No, there
But-
isn't. There's a waiting list of over.
Oh, so there's a
1,000
waiting,
children.
there's a waiting list even for the ones who have sought it, let alone for all of the ones that aren't on the waiting list
Don't know
because
about
they
it.
haven't sought it,
Yeah.
so.
Well, and the other place for them to get their therapies at school on a very limited basis, but that takes away from their instructional time. So you don't really
Sure.
wanna do that. That was a great, what was her name, was that? I would like to-
Rhonda Mattingly.
Rhonda Mattingly.
It's in your just supplemental dissertations.
I know that children with intellectual disability, depends on the level of the IQ, they can actually receive what you call a Michelle P. waiver.
Mhm. That's what she's talking about.
1,362 people on the waiting list.
Yeah, but for Michelle, I actually work in that area, and actually for Michelle P. waiver, it's easy to get. So if you're on the waiting list, it's probably not Michelle. I don't know if it's Michelle P. waiver. It might be SCL, supported living.
Michelle P. Waiver.
So now, okay, because that's what I do. So you shouldn't be on the waiting list, to be honest with you. But
1,362
Yeah.
people.
I just actually helped a friend get her child in, and I mean, right away she wasn't on a waiting list.
My daughter has
so
high needs too,
That's all.
according to the doctor. IQ 46.
I'll call you.
Are you okay?
Please.
No, I do work for the state in the Department of Intellectual Disability, and so I go
Is that
to.
through community care?
No, that's
through the
actually like
DIG?
yes. And so that's what I oversee, like the agencies that provide those services. So that's why I'm shocked, unless there's
According to
some.
Lyris Cunningham.
Okay.
There's-
Yeah, Lyris she is the one who's totally over Michelle P. right now, so things may have changed, but I'll check for you.
I would wholeheartedly appreciate that.
We'll do that.
Yeah, because I have received nothing. Yeah. Okay, anyway.
We should.
She receives nothing, I should say.
By the way, an analogy. If you're thinking of doing document or content analysis, here's an analogy. If you're doing an interview study, you're going to have your research questions, and then the interview questions, the research questions, what you want to find out. But you would not ask your interview questions of your subjects. That is, you're going to have an interview schedule. And the rule of thumb is that there are anywhere from 2 to 5 questions on your interview schedule for every research question. That is going to take 2 or 3 or 4 questions from that person to elicit all of the information necessary
Yes.
to match up with a research question. So if you have 6 research questions, you may have 6 times 4, you may have 24 interview schedule questions.
Yes.
All right, the analogy is that the document analysis protocol is to a content analysis study as the interview schedule is to an interview study. So what is the document analysis protocol? The list of questions on your document analysis, that you are, and these are the questions that you read for you to pull the information from the document. So you're going through these 3 dissertations.
Yes.
That's your document source. All right, well, you have a set of questions. And those 24 questions, all right, you get question number 1, and you read through those 3 dissertations, and anytime you come to information that's relevant to question number 1, put that in. All right, then you do that with question number 2. And you may have 24 questions, which in effect, instead of interviewing a person, you are reading that question to yourself to pull that information from the source.
Okay.
That's kind of the
That's when you visit
parallel.
the Vulcan Library.
Yeah, so that's kind of the parallel between the document analysis protocol, a set of questions that you're using to guide what you're pulling out of your content sources.
So you're asking that dissertation
Yes.
questions instead of asking the person.
Yes, and then after you ask it, then you have to read through it and pull that out yourself. Or else you would have trained research assistants to do that for you, maybe, if you have a big grant and you've got money.
Okay.
In fact, Brant, you guys have done some of that with some of the projects you've been working on with Dr. Shong, haven't you?
Say that again. I'm sorry.
And haven't you guys had lists of things that you go through and pull out of those personalized learning plans and stuff? That's a
Sure,
that's a
sure.
form of content analysis.
Sure, we've gone through large
Yeah,
lists of articles.
and you have certain questions, certain things that you're looking for. So that would be a form of content analysis.
Sure, we're
Yeah.
doing that.
Yeah.
That's a lot of what I did last fall.
Yeah.
That was actually most of what I did.
And similar to the personal observation, where you needed to pay close attention to what was going on in the room other than just what was said, but the feelings and the smells and the temperature and such. You can also have things other than documents. You can have objects, pictures, clothing, pottery, trash, those sort of.
More and more qualitative researchers take cameras and video cameras. Except, you gotta be careful that that's on your IRB.
Especially if you have children.
Yeah. But even if you're not, if you start snapping pictures and you have it, that's not a part of the consent form, and people may get very upset with that.
It provides background information useful for selecting site, program, or population. Okay. In the analysis of documents, okay, rich in portraying values and beliefs of participants in the settings, you have appropriate documents, okay. Example, minutes, meetings, logs, announcements, formal policies, and journals. Some minutes and meetings are not taken appropriately or taken just a couple of words that you couldn't understand, so I have to have appropriate documents for those.
How many of you are familiar with the expression unobtrusive measures? Unobtrusive measures. That goes back to Weber's research in the 60s. It was kind of the classic on that. Anyway, the notion of unobtrusive measures is that if you're doing an interview, then the person you're interviewing is clearly aware of the fact that you're getting data from them. And in some respects, that person's behavior is going to have impacted by the fact that you're collecting data from them. If you're just observing, if Dean Evans came in and sat in the back, we would all be aware of that. And it would probably, at least for the first hour or so, it would probably affect both how I interact and how you interact. All right. There would be an impact from being observed. In qualitative research, there are some what we call unobtrusive measures. Now let me give you an example of that. when I was grad assistant with Brookover, way back in the 70s at Michigan State, and he was one of the leading researchers, one of the people who was developing the research on school effectiveness. And so, as a grad assistant, I would sometimes get to go out and collect data. And because of limited funds, we would sometimes set up a double so that I would collect data in the afternoon at one school, stay overnight, and then hit the next school early in the morning. So you did a faculty meeting, you set it up so you'd have faculty meeting after school, faculty meeting the morning, and you could do the two different schools on one trip. And so I had done data collection at one school in the afternoon and finished up there, drove to the other school and got there late in the evening, maybe 5 o'clock. And the only people still in the building were the custodians, and I just caught the principal on it going out the door, and he said, "Oh, glad to see you," because he knew I was coming. "Go ahead and have a look around." The superintendent just called an emergency meeting of the principal, so he was on his way at 5 o'clock to another meeting. And he said, "Look around." He said, "Set up, look around, and I'll see you in the morning." So I set up, and then I'm in the building by myself with custodians who were ignoring me. It was an elementary school. It was an L-shaped elementary school. Down one side of the L was the intermediate, and down the other side was the primary. So as I'm just walking down, the thing that immediately struck me as I'm walking down the primary wing is that the walls are covered with student work. And much of it had to do with, depending on the age of the kids, more pictures, less words. The older kids, by the time we got to third grade, still pictures, but certainly a lot of words. It was the whole thing of writing about what they had been drawing. So language in terms of developing their own language. And then you went inside the rooms and you had the same thing. Focus on student work, and much of it had to do with writing and or pictures, to the extent that more writing the older the kids, but clearly learning to tell stories and to write about their own experiences. It just suffused the entire L, the side of that. Then I went down the intermediate. The walls were Spartan, with one exception. Nothing on the walls except about every 2 rooms you saw repeated a set of classroom rules. All in the thou shalt not, thou shalt not, thou shalt not, thou shalt not talk, thou shalt not breathe, thou shalt, maybe not quite that bad, but that was the tone of it. And you went inside those, the same, and by the way, it was always the same. They clearly had collaborated because it was always the same sign. You went inside, and every room had that posted at least twice, in 2 different rooms, 2 different walls, and again, no student work. It was just Spartan. And it was clear that there was like conflict between the teachers and the students that was represented by these signs, and on the others there was just this complete look at what we can produce together. When we got the data back, this was school effectiveness stuff, we got bimodal distribution. Now, we would not, without those, and by the way, nobody knew that I was able to collect those data just with observational field notes without anybody seeing me. So none of the teachers were aware of these notes. But then later when the data came back and you had this 2-hump, bimodal distribution, it was very easy to put my notes with those 2 humps and say, this is like 2 different schools here. It's the same school, but they're operating in different ways. So that's one way that you can think about the importance of analysis of documents, but also unobtrusive as opposed to intrusive measures. Does that make sense?
I was just thinking, though you couldn't necessarily attribute a reason why one group.
No, but you
Yeah.
can certainly see, and then when you got the bimodal distribution for that school, which most of the schools weren't getting that, and Dr. Brookover would say, "What's going on here?" And I said, "Oh yeah, I collected data," and then to explain that, and he said, "Oh yeah," because it began to make sense.
Well, because I know like our school is similar, but then during the state testing, the one whole section is required to remove everything from the hallways and the
Yeah.
walls. So that section really looks sparse but
Yeah.
purposefully.
That wasn't the case here,
Okay,
this was
yeah.
just difference between the two groups.
Okay. Analysis of documents are rich in portraying values and beliefs. So here you have to look for the bias and such of the participants in the settings. Okay. The last, archival data recording officials is another way of looking at data. Go on. Other artifact analysis is those not encoded in text, religious icons, clothing, housing forms, food. Okay. Analysis may require an analytic approach and use of textbooks, novels, newspapers, email messages, and political speeches. Advantage, it does not, there you go, it does not disrupt ongoing events, and the disadvantage is the interpretation is left to the researcher. Okay, or no interpretation, you could just state what came.
Historians often use archival data. In education, we probably don't take advantage of studying archival data to the extent that we could.
I know the Kentucky Historical Society has a big push on getting people's stories, collecting those. Interesting. Here we go. Transcribing and translating is critically important. There you go. Requires judgment and interpretation. It's hard to get away from that. You want to put down your non-bias, but also people can put down judgment interpretations in it. Data is no longer raw, then it is processed. Okay? No visual clues when transcribing necessarily, unless you have gone in and taken visual and gotten permission to do that. Translation is the transfer of meaning from a source language to a target language, and an interpreter, could be yourself, is used. Transcribing and translating continued. 3 important questions. Identify the translation act in the research report. Does it matter if the researcher is the translator? Are you going to put bias into that? Should the translator be involved in the analysis? The ethical issues again. Represent how well we demonstrate respect for those when we transpose their spoken word into text and write it up. Okay. Ethics. Here we go back to Star Trek. In Star Trek, the prime directive commands that there can be no interference with the internal development of alien civilizations. Okay, the researcher's ethical concerns include privacy, translation difficulties, bias, power, influence issues, harm or distress, and consent, among others. From our book, information from our book.
Very good, thank you.
Thank you. That's okay, thank you. And I can print out something if you want to go along with this, but I just, it's going to be next week.
Why don't you just email your PowerPoint to everybody? Why don't you just do that?
Okay.
Okay, why don't we take a quick break and then we'll think about, are there any more personal presentations for today?